In this video, we're going to work on solving quadratic equations using what's called the quadratic formula. So we've learned two methods so far. We know how to solve by graphing, we plug it into our calculator, and we know how to solve by taking square roots. So this method is another method, and this method will work for any quadratic equation that's in standard form. All right, so today's notes will be titled Quadratic Formula. Make sure you put today's date in the top corner, and we're going to take a look at how we use the quadratic formula. So here's the general form of a quadratic. You have what's called standard form. So we have what's called ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We know this is a quadratic equation because the highest degree is 2, or that's the largest exponent of all the problems, of all the terms. So with any equation in this form, in standard form, you can use the quadratic formula, which looks like this. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So this formula is probably the most intense formula we've done in class, and it's going to require the most steps when you're solving. So essentially, when you have an equation in this form, you look for these values of the coefficients a, b, and c, the constant c, and you plug them in, and then you just evaluate. The equation has to be in standard form, which means it goes x squared, then x, and then the constant if there is one, equal to 0. So let's just start off by practicing identifying the a, b, and c values. Okay, so let's say I gave you this equation. It's a quadratic equation, y equals x squared minus 10x plus 20. I want to identify the a, b, and c values. So the a is the coefficient of the x squared term. So if there's no number there, we always write 1. The b is the coefficient of the x term. So in this case, it's negative 10. You got to make sure you have the right sign. And then the c is always your constant value, which this problem is just 20. So once you know these values, you just take them and you plug them into the formula and solve. Here's another example. So in this problem, a is 1, b is also 1, and c is 2. It's really important you understand how to identify the terms and the values of these coefficients because that's going to determine the answers to your problems. Some other examples. In this problem, the coefficient of x squared is negative 1, b is 10, but here there is no c value, so I put it as a 0. Let's look at two more examples. In this example, 3 is the coefficient of x squared, There is no x term, so it's 0 again. And then this time there is a constant value of 15. Then our last example. So I've got 2 is my a value, -7 is my b value, and -5 is my c value. So again, once you've identified the coefficients of the numbers, that gives you the a, b, and c values, and now you can just plug them into that formula. So we're going to practice plugging it in using the formula. So let's say I give you this equation. And again, this is going to be a lot of steps. I just want to prepare you for the amount of steps that we're going to have to follow in order to do this problem. Let's say you're given x squared minus 2x minus 15 equals 0. The first thing you have to do is identify your a, b, and c values. So in this problem, a equals 1, b equals -2, and c equals -15. I'm going to rewrite the formula over here just as a quick snapshot. So using these values, I'm going to plug in a, b, and c into this formula and tell you what the answer is. Because what we're looking for is what values of x are going to give me 0. That's the whole point of this formula. We're solving it. So I'm going to plug in these values. I don't know what x equals yet. The opposite of b, so notice this is one of the biggest mistakes people make. The opposite of b, I had to write that -2 times. The one negative in front of the b, and then what the b value was negative. Plus or minus the square root of, inside of parentheses, -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times -15 all over 2 times 1. So two of the biggest mistakes people make is forgetting if there's two negatives, you got to write them both. And then the fraction bar is over underneath everything, not just this part with the square root. So how I like to do this problem is use my calculator to take care of this thing underneath the square root. And to do that, all I really need to do is type in what's underneath the square root and not worry about the square root just yet. So I've got -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times -15. So all of that part right here just turns into 64. I just typed in exactly as I saw it underneath the square root. So I can rewrite that this equals, I'm also going to take care of this part because a negative negative is a positive. So 2 plus or minus the square root of 64 over 2. And now here, it's a lot easier. And I'm going to branch it off into two separate problems because there's a plus or minus. Remember when we did graphing, there were two answers? Here's where it's coming from. So 2 plus the square root of 64 is 8 over 2. Or 2 minus the square root of 64 again is 8 over 2. So I've got two problems there. Two plus 8 equals 10. Divided by 2 equals 5. So that's one of my solutions. 2 minus 8 is -6. Divided by 2 is -3. And that's using the quadratic formula. Let's take a look at another example that doesn't turn out to have such a nice answer. All right, so number 2, we're going to have 2x squared plus 3x minus 6 equals 0. And we're going to identify our a, b, and c values here. So a equals 2, b equals 3, and c equals negative 6. I'm going to rewrite the formula over here just as a quick little snapshot. Opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I'm just going to use my values and plug them into the formula. So I have x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So again, I was just plugging in the values that a, b, and c equal. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the problem before. I'm just going to type in underneath the square root. So I have 3 squared minus 4 times a times c. This gives me 57. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 57 all over 6. For this problem, if I can't square root that number, 57, which I cannot, doesn't give me a nice number, I'm actually done. So these are actually easier problems because you can stop right here. This is your solution. And that's using the quadratic formula. So we're going to practice with these ones. Again, just remember there's a lot of steps in this. So you got to be really careful as you're plugging in your answers. And you should hopefully get to either a solution that looks like this or a solution where you get 2 nice numbers. We'll also look at, in a future video, problems that have complex answers where the negative pops up underneath the square root. And that's why we spent time with complex numbers.